So on the 11th of May, e-tangata reporter Connie Buchanan interviewed a wahine Māori support worker who is directly impacted by the government's attacks on pay equity. And I want to start by talking about this interview at length because I think it highlights and touches on so many of the issues that I want to talk about with this talk. So the interviewee is a community health support worker who works with elderly and disabled people. She describes the intensive care that these clients need, some of whom are paraplegic. She describes also giving mental health support, and in one instance, even walking in on a client who was trying to take his own life. And as she says, support workers are often first responders. She says that she loves her job, which helps people to keep their autonomy, and she also describes how it helps to relieve the tension on sort of overcrowded hospitals, this work that she's doing. Most of her clients, she says, most of her colleagues, she says, have about 20 clients a day. And they're doing things like eating in their car in order to make it to all of the clients in a day. The employer pays a minimum wage. This worker spends 70% of her monthly income on rent. She is a single mother and sometimes has to go to the food bank to feed her son. She says, quote, "I'd worked as a labourer before this. I worked mainly with men. It got to the point where I thought, nah, stuff this. I'm not here to get treated like I'm a piece of something." So she left. She says, "Back then, I used to be in credit with my power company. Now I get warning notices. I started to put feelers out for private clients so I can earn a bit more. But if I'm working longer hours, then who misses out? My son." Her employers have consistently pushed back against wage increases. They threaten their workers, saying if there is industrial action, there will be consequences. She says the last pay rise that they've had, aside from increases in the minimum wage, was a 3% increase in 2007. To quote from this worker, "That's why the pay equity claim was so important. That sort of action is the only way we have of forcing our employer to pay us more. We're women. We're Māori and Pacific women, women from migrant communities, Indians and Filipinas, and it's like they don't value us. And now this government seems to assume that what we do, these jobs, aren't very valuable or important either." She describes the cuts to pay equity as a punch in the gut. I want you to please keep this kōrero in mind as we go through the rest of this talk. So what I want to try to capture in this talk is the attacks on gender equality and gender freedoms as class war, as a two-pronged attack on material and ideological grounds. And I hope that this will also help to illustrate the general dynamics of gender oppression under capitalism and some of its complexity, as well as the specific period of gender repression. So I'm calling it that, reflecting the fact that this is a period of overt crackdowns and repression of these. To narrow down this sort of huge topic for myself, so I'm mainly talking about today, but trying to cover some of the overall dynamics as well. I am focusing on New Zealand, but I invite you to make broader connections to these as well. So how do things like the gendered division of labour, things like gender repression as a tool of political domination play out within different countries and also across countries? Okay, so contrary to the Flintstones view of history, the specific gender and family roles in our society are not universal and unchanging, and neither is gendered oppression. So the concepts that we are calling gender, for the purposes of this talk, have varied immensely across time and place. My understanding of gender is historical materialist. Gender, as we say, is a social construct. There is no biological reason why pink is for girls and blue is for boys. Gender is all about the roles and identities that are available for you in a given society. It's about how you see yourself and how society sees you. And these ideas change over time. This, if you like, is the historical side of historical materialism. The material side is that these ideas don't come out of nowhere. So the word culture, as someone pointed out in one of our recent Salient articles, I suspect it might have been Brad, the word itself comes from the soil, from the practice of tilling and tending to it. Culture is shaped by our environment and how we relate to and interact with our environment. In particular, ideas around gender tend to be shaped by the work of sustaining a society and how this work is divided up within a given society. So our bodies are part of this equation. The logistics of childbirth and breastfeeding, for example, are one facet of this. But contrary to the biological determinists, we recognize that this is a complex equation and that our bodies are only one factor in it. Other factors include technology, geography, and the wider organization of society. There isn't a reductive one-to-one relationship between reproductive biology and a rigid binary division of gendered labor. For one thing, human biology is diverse. Intersex people exist, and many of the assumed differences between the so-called biological sexes, things like height and strength, actually tend to exist on a spectrum with significant overlap. And in many respects, there is more diversity within the so-called biological sexes than there are between them. In any given society, factors like age, skill, strength, and personal preference can be just as important when it comes to the division of labor. And when it comes to reproductive biology, the ways and extent to which this impacts the gender division of labor depends on things like how childcare is organized, what sort of work is available for pregnant and breastfeeding people, what technology is available, how easily can pregnancy and conception be controlled, what are the incentives to have more or less children. All kinds of factors like this play a role. So with so many diverse factors and such complex and at times unexpected relationships between the material and the cultural, it's no wonder that there has been such huge variety in gender roles across history and across different cultures, including differing numbers of socially recognized genders, differing ability to move between different gendered roles, different ideas about what is and is not a gendered thing in a society, and varying levels of equality between people of different genders. This is an article I recommend reading from Ashley McFall about Fa'afine, which is an Indigenous Samoan gender. So the evolution of gender roles under capitalism has been very complex, and more complex than I can actually discuss in the space of one talk. But overall, the capitalist era has been one of rigid, persistent, and unequal gender divisions. And these divisions aren't simply holdovers or relics from a previous age. Capitalism generates and sustains its own unequal gender divisions. The upshot of this is that women are an oppressed group under capitalism, as are gender and sexual minorities. And of course, these aren't mutually exclusive categories either. Along with oppressing specific groups, and this is part of the theme of my talk, capitalist gender structures are something that restrict and discipline our whole class. So the oppressive nature of gender roles under capitalism comes from the fact that capitalism is a class society, with a ruling class that has a need to exert control over the population, and in the fact that the underlying principle of this society, enforced by that ruling class, is the accumulation of profit at the expense of all other considerations. So central to capitalist gender roles is the nuclear family. So in this model, individual families made up of parents and children are responsible for sustaining themselves. As the capitalist class owns or controls all of the means of production, so the land, the resources, etc., working class families have to rely on wages to sustain themselves. The traditional model of this is that a man works for a wage in order to support his family, while women do the unpaid care work in the home. This is not a formation that people just organically sort themselves into, but it's something that has been actively cultivated through interventions by employers and the state. For example, the family wage paid historically to male workers so that they can support wives and children, along with legal penalties for deviations from this model, and of course, the denial of economic independence to women. So in New Zealand, it wasn't until the 1980s that single women were reliably able to open bank accounts or take out mortgages in their own name without having a male relative to guarantee the loan. So the exporting of capitalism from Europe through colonialism imposed these relations across the world through the brutal suppression of gender diverse practices. An early architect of colonization in New Zealand, Edward Wakefield, once said that mankind has adopted a simple contrivance for promoting the accumulation of capital, which is, quote, to divide themselves into owners of capital and owners of labor. It's not how I would describe that process, but fine. Wakefield's goal was, quote, to transplant English society with its various gradations, i.e. class divisions, in due proportion. In 1865, then Justice Minister Henry Sewell outlined the aims of the Native Land Court, quote, to destroy the principle of communism upon which the Māori social system is based, and which stands as a barrier in way of all attempts to amalgamate the Māori race into our social and political system. So Māori communal society, including communal childcare and traditional gender roles, was repressed through violence, dispossession, and indoctrination. Thankfully, these ideas and practices have not been entirely lost. Mana Wahine is an ongoing inquiry with the Waitangi Tribunal addressing claims that Crown action since colonisation has eroded the status of Māori women in society, denying their rights over land and political participation, diminishing the flexibility of gender roles allowed by communal childcare, suppressing traditional roles and practices, and relegating Wahine to a second-class status. The role of tāne was also transformed by colonisation, largely into a marginalised and expendable pool of wage labour. This resource cited here discusses traditional Māori whānau structures, including the very prominent role of tāne in nurturing and child rearing, something which cuts against both capitalist gender expectations and contemporary racist stereotypes of Māori men. Takatapui is a term that historically refers to an intimate companion of the same sex, and it's a term that has been reclaimed from the 1980s to describe Māori people of diverse gender and sexual identities. And part of this reclamation is, as researchers such as Elizabeth Kirikiri have been exploring, the idea that there was acceptance of gender and sexual diversity prior to colonisation, the very history of which has been suppressed. So the period of the 1930s to the 50s was a period, broadly speaking, that saw an emphasis on the nuclear family in New Zealand, with things such as the way that the welfare structure is structured, things like the family wage, being part of sort of emphasising this. This was also the era of Māori urban migration as landholdings shrank. And this included the practice of pepper potting, where the Department of Māori Affairs deliberately scattered Māori families in amongst non-Māori families in order to sort of break up broader networks. The disproportionate uplifting of Māori children by the state has also been part of this legacy of assimilation. And the government is currently dismantling protections that were put in place to protect against this. So they're repealing policies with Oranga Tamariki, which prioritise placing Tamariki Māori within kinship networks of the hapu and whānau. So still attacking those sort of broader networks of care. Okay, so let's look at these contemporary attacks, which are coming in from the government. So the concept of social reproduction has been an important one for Marxists when it comes to understanding the link between gender and profit. So social reproduction is a term for all of the work that goes into reproducing the working class on an individual and a generational level. So childcare, education, cooking, cleaning, healthcare, making sure there is a next generation of workers and making sure that workers are replenished each day to keep working. In a modern capitalist country like New Zealand, some of this is socialised, so public childcare, healthcare, housing, etc. But a lot of it is privatised, either bought and sold for a profit or done by individual families in the home. So this becomes a site of class struggle as the capitalist class fights to fork over as little as possible into this process. This process which, keeps them supplied with labour. or to open up more of it to profit making. You can see these dynamics at play today as governments in New Zealand and around the world respond to economic difficulties by cutting or privatising social services and pushing more of this burden onto individual families. The traditional model of the nuclear family that assumes a male breadwinner and a female homemaker is not a literal reality for most working class families today. But it is still something that shapes what families and what the wider society looks like. So women still have lower workforce participation than men, are more likely to take time off work for care responsibilities, taking a significant financial hit in the process. And women, of course, still do more of the household work, even when they are also working. All of this sort of unpaid work and these divisions feed into gendered social expectations around women being, sort of caring, submissive, available. And it also leads to women's work outside the home being devalued. And you can read more about the nuclear family in Lily's article in the latest paper. So the 1960 Equal Pay Act said that women had to receive equal pay for equal work in the public service in New Zealand. The 1972 Act extended this to the private sector. Subsequent legal battles have fought to realise the principle of pay equity, the idea that women should be paid equally not just for the same work as men, but for work of equal skill, effort, responsibility, etc. This is to tackle the issue that women have tended to be concentrated in certain kinds of work, and that this work is underpaid because it is performed by women and because it is considered feminine. So a lot of this work is things that is associated with this unpaid work in the home. The coalition government has taken a torch to all of this. So the existing policy said that you could raise a pay equity claim if your workforce was 60% female. The government has raised this threshold to 70%, which would exclude workforces such as teachers, which many people think is deliberate. They're also restricting job comparisons to jobs within the same industry, completely defeating the point of comparators. So they have explicitly said that this will save them money. It's going to save them $11 billion over the next 4 years, allowing them to maintain tax cuts and other policies beneficial to the rich. MPs like Brooke Van Velden have been proudly displaying the very prejudice that these laws are meant to address by openly sneering at cross-industry comparators, so mocking the idea that social workers, that their work could be compared to that of air traffic controllers, for example, highlighting the very need for these pay equity legislation. So one of the risks of traditional gender roles for women is that they put women and minors in a position of dangerous economic dependence. So attacks on pay equity need to be seen as attacks on economic independence for women and gender minorities. And I don't think that it's an accident that internationally we're seeing this push back towards traditional gender roles while we're also seeing this cutting back of things that actually give people other options. So they're telling us, to get back in the kitchen and start learning how to make butter from RNZ. And meanwhile, they're cutting the jobs, so we don't have any other choices. Speaking of other options, so while at times capitalism has shown some flexibility, some ability to accommodate diversity within the nuclear family model, or even in some limited instances, alternatives to the nuclear family model, this traditional model still continues to be extremely pervasive. And on the whole, divergent sexual and gender identities and practices have always been sort of troubling to this model. You can see from the very description of it that there isn't really much room for that within this model. The ruling class is sort of worried that once you reject compulsory heterosexuality, people start to get all kinds of ideas. So gender and sexual expression, which doesn't align with the goals of reproducing the working class within the nuclear family, has been treated as suspect. And in New Zealand, it's been socially marginalised and criminalised in various ways as well. So it wasn't until 2017 that people who'd been prosecuted for homosexuality had this removed from their criminal records. Relatedly, reproductive bodily autonomy has tended to be something that limits our dependence on the nuclear family and generally gives us greater autonomy at workers. So you can see where the suspicion of that comes from as well. And I think you can see international attacks on queer and particularly trans rights in the light of this in part, so as the part of the sort of retrenching of the nuclear family. In Aotearoa, these attacks include erasing gender diversity from sex ed, turning gender-affirming care for minors into a matter for public debate, appointing a known transphobe to the Human Rights Commission, and directing Health New Zealand, as someone's already alluded to, not to use inclusive language such as pregnant people in their communications. When it comes to capitalism and oppression, it's a mistake to always look for a one-to-one relationship between oppression and profit. So attacks on oppressed groups are also about maintaining that profit-making system as a whole and enforcing class rule. So overseas, you can see links between this increasing gender repression and attacks on trans people and authoritarianism. And I think even here you can see the way that gender is being used to discipline the working class. So in the same way that people are sneering at librarians and cleaners for thinking that their work is of value, they're sneering at the idea that workers might have a right to express themselves in terms of their gender and sexuality. So I kind of see it as, a sort of a political austerity. Like, we don't get nice things, essentially. And then, of course, you have the use of trans people in particular as political scapegoats. So New Zealand First and Winston Peters in particular are taking advantage of the fact that trans people are sort of misunderstood minority to whip up prejudice and to sort of get themselves attention and political gain. So removing gender ideology from school was part of their coalition agreement with National, as was attacking trans inclusion in sports, and the government is making moves on this now, sort of like looking into those policies. They tried to put forward a trans bathroom ban, which I think luckily they've sort of like shelved that for now. And of course, they've proposed legislating the definition of man and woman. So as a ballot bill, there's a chance that this will never even get to be debated. But the point is that it gives Winston Peters an opportunity to say nasty transphobic stuff in public. And the benefit to the right and the capitalists as a whole is that all of this distracts people from the actual sources of their problems, which are not trans people, as a matter of fact. And I think all of these politicians who are sort of like stirring up transphobic sentiment, they often pretend like, it's not that I have a problem with trans people. But the fact that bigots like Brian Tamaki are feeling emboldened to sort of go out with their groups and harass people and attack pride events, I think the politicians bear responsibility for that, right? Because they are normalizing this and they're telling the bigots that this is okay. Which leads us to discussing men. So there is a common misconception that the right cares about men and the left does not care about men. And I think I can understand where this comes from, but to clarify, the right does not care about men, the right cares about masculinity. So for the right, masculinity is a tool which helps them to exploit the labor of working class men, to feed them to the imperial meat grinder that is the military, and to turn them into shock troops against movements for liberation. So I'm going to talk about the nuclear family once more, and this time I'm going to talk about it through the lens of The Simpsons. So there is a flashback episode where when, Homer and Marge are younger, and Homer is finally able to quit his fairly well-paying job at the power plant and get his dream job at a bowling alley, I think. He loves it. He's so happy. And then they discover that Marge is pregnant again with their third child, Maggie. And so Homer has to literally crawl back to his boss on his knees and take this job that he hates back again. And to rub this in, Mr. Burns puts a sign up on his wall that says, "Don't forget, you're here forever." Extremely accurate representation of capitalists in The Simpsons. So what Homer does is he takes photos of baby Maggie and he puts them on this sign so that it says, "Do it for her." And I find this episode extremely moving and sort of distressing in some ways, because these are the same message. This is the same message. And this is the role of the nuclear family in disciplining workers. And to be clear, this applies to workers of all genders. It applies especially to single mothers, like the worker we discussed at the start of this. And 82% of these are women. And it's something that all of the cuts that we've talked about already will exacerbate. Your children need you. You need to work. Don't kick up a fuss. Something which is difficult to kind of get your head around and which I've struggled to convey in this talk is the complex ways that the sort of traditional nuclear family with sort of the male breadwinner, single income, both does and does not exist for working class families. So as a actual literal model, it is the reality for very few families. Although, as we've discussed, it still does shape families in many ways. So the term sort of couple with children is still the most common model of the family, and you can see the way that these gendered dynamics play in, even when usually most partners are having to work to a certain extent. But you can see the way that clearly this model still persists, and this dynamic here, the do it for her, while it applies to all people, culturally it's assumed to apply more to men, and the cultural pressure is more on men. Something that makes me really nervous about the current political situation is there is this ideological push back towards this traditional family without any material basis for it. So far from reinstating the family wage, and building state homes and things like that, governments are overseeing low wages, job cuts, and a tax on welfare. And contrary to fantasies being pushed by the right, masculinity has no ability to conjure jobs or to raise wages, and neither do any of the actions that the right-wing governments are taking. So there is this general contradiction in capitalism where we are told that we need to be pushed into these nuclear families and support our families, but we're not given the means to do so, and families are in fact sort of torn apart by capitalism as well. Again, thinking about the one we talked about at the beginning of this talk. When gender dynamics are introduced into this mismatch between expectations and material reality creates, psychological distress, yes, but this is also precisely the conditions that lead to an uptick in family violence, intimate partner violence, and other forms of gendered violence, for men in particular, as this intense focus on these expectations comes up against absolutely no way to actually realize them. So interpersonal violence is one of the ways that men get turned into, as I mentioned, shock troops to enforce class rule. It also happens through recruitment to the military or police, radicalization into acts of individual terrorism, and recruitment into right-wing movements. So, looking at that article that I referenced at the beginning again, so Rohan has written an article in the paper and on the website about the way that misogyny is being used as an overt force on the right to recruit people. So within these movements, wealthy, powerful men deploy masculinity to make the working class men think that feminism and women is the cause of all of their problems and the reasons they can't attain these, impossible standards. And to make them think that they are on the same team, when in fact, obviously, the wealthy have nothing but contempt for working class men, and you see that at every turn. In Aotearoa, the Gender Attitude Survey has been run from 2017 to 2023, and it's shown that while there is still broad support for gender equality in New Zealand, there has been a small but worrying trend towards more conservative gender attitudes in some regards. So here are some statistics from the 2023 survey that are a bit concerning. Another concerning statistic that I found in this survey is that 41% of male respondents believed that, quote, false rape accusations are common. The survey also found that while there was an increase in accepting attitudes towards transgender people, despite all of the transphobia people trying to stir up, this was much lower among men than among women. So any increase in oppressive attitudes poses a risk to our class, both in the harm that can then be inflicted upon oppressed groups and also in the erosion of the solidarity that we need to fight for our rights. So I want to conclude by, I want to take a moment to counterpose masculinity to class struggle. Sorry, I don't mean to be flippant with the Simpsons stuff. It just makes me feel a bit better. Because I would argue that one of these actually delivers more effectively on the hollow promises of the others. So the practice of fighting for your rights is an assertion of dignity and worth. In class struggle, there are actual opportunities to at least defend jobs, improve working conditions, potentially put more food on the table. The issue for those attached to traditional masculinity is that class struggle at its most successful challenges that ideology. It challenges hierarchy, telling you to act collectively to confront your boss rather than trying to climb the ladder. It necessitates solidarity and working together with people of all genders and sexualities as comrades in struggle, and together with that, the deconstruction of sexist stereotypes. And it involves recognizing that demands for fulfilling work, dignity, security for your loved ones, these aren't actually demands that are exclusive to men. These are things that any worker can aspire to, regardless of gender. And if you're concerned about the well-being of the class as a whole, it also involves acknowledging that one's worth should not be tied to productivity, and that people have a right to dignity and respect when they are not in paid work. And of course, all of this comes up against the limits of capitalism that we have talked about. So we see class struggle as a path forward towards revolutionary change. And ultimately, the socialist vision is for a collective egalitarian society. And this is not compatible with capitalist gender roles that insist that some people are put in a dependent or subordinate position. And it's not compatible with a privatized, atomized version of family life where it's each family out for itself and you only care about your own kids. It's far more compatible, in fact, with communal indigenous practices that capitalist states have actively tried to eradicate. Yeah, so one of our key slogans this year has been turn the culture war into class war. And I think what's becoming clear is that what we mean by that is that the culture war is class war in varying levels of disguise. And we need to expose this in order to turn the tide of this struggle in our favor. Thank you.